Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into one of the most devastating conflicts in all of human history, World War I. But to really get it, you can't think of it as just a single event. It was more like a catastrophic chain reaction, a series of dominoes falling one after another, leading to an absolute global catastrophe. And this is the question at the very heart of the whole story. I mean, it sounds impossible, right? How could a single assassination in one city possibly ignite a firestorm that engulfs the entire planet? Well, to understand how, we've got to rewind the clock and look at what the world was like before that fateful shot was ever fired. So I want you to think of Europe in the early 20th century as a giant tinderbox, just waiting for a spark. The whole continent was primed for a massive conflict long before 1914. And there were these four key ingredients, these four volatile ingredients that were making it so incredibly flammable. Now, these causes are often simplified with a really handy acronym, M-A-I-N. First up, M for militarism. We're talking about a massive arms race. As countries like Germany and Britain built up these huge navies, armies all across Europe were expanding, creating this climate of fear and suspicion. Next, A for alliances. This created a really dangerous tripwire system across the continent. Then you've got I for imperialism, as all the major powers scrambled for colonies and resources, leading to some pretty intense rivalries. And finally, N for nationalism, this incredibly powerful force of national pride that, especially down in the Balkans, created this burning desire for independence. At the very heart of this whole alliance problem, Europe was basically divided into two huge armed camps. On one side, you had the Triple Alliance. That's Germany, Austria-Hungary, and, for a while, Italy. And on the other side, you had the Triple Entente, France, Great Britain, and Russia. Now, what this system pretty much guaranteed was that a small regional fight could never stay small. An attack on one was considered an attack on all. So you've got the tinderbox, right? It's packed with militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Now, all it needs is a spark. And that spark came on a summer day in the city of Sarajevo. And here it is. This was the catalyst. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the entire Austro-Hungarian throne, was shot and killed. The assassin, a young man named Gavrilo Princip, was a Serbian nationalist. He was fighting to free his people from Austro-Hungarian rule. This single act of political violence was about to set the entire world on fire. Okay, so with that fuse now lit, the dominoes just started to fall, one after another, with terrifying speed. That complex web of alliances that was supposed to keep the peace? Yeah, it did the exact opposite. It guaranteed that the war would spread like wildfire. I mean, the speed of this escalation is just breathtaking. Look at this. On July 28th, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Just 2 days later, Russia, who's Serbia's protector, starts mobilizing its massive army. The very next day, August 1st, Germany declares war on Russia, and then 2 days later on France. Finally, when Germany invades neutral Belgium as a shortcut to attack France, Great Britain declares war on Germany. In just 1 week, all the major powers of Europe were at war. The war that followed was unlike anything the world had ever seen before. This was not a war of swift movements and glorious cavalry charges. No, this was a grinding, industrialized conflict that introduced a whole new level of horror to the world. You know, the iconic image of World War I is, without a doubt, the trench. Soldiers on the Western Front dug literally hundreds of miles of these deep ditches, creating this static, brutal battlefield. Life in them was absolutely miserable, and trying to cross the deadly open area between the trenches, an area known as no man's land, was pretty much a suicide mission. And this all led to a bloody stalemate that just dragged on for years. And what made that stalemate so incredibly deadly was all the new technology. You had machine guns that could just cut down waves of advancing soldiers. Poison gas brought a completely new and horrifying kind of terror to the battlefield. In response, tanks were developed to try and break through the trench lines, while brand new airplanes took the war up into the skies. It was just this horrifying blend of old-world tactics and new, incredibly deadly weapons. And this wasn't just a war fought by soldiers on some distant front. No, this was what we call a total war. Entire national economies were completely redirected to produce weapons and supplies. Women entered the workforce in massive numbers to fill the gaps. Propaganda posters were everywhere, rallying support back at home. The line between the home front and the battlefront had never been so blurry. So,
After 4 incredibly long and brutal years, the war finally came to an end. But it left these deep, permanent scars on the world, completely changing the political map and the course of history forever.
The human cost, it's almost impossible to really comprehend. We're talking about roughly 16 million people, soldiers and civilians, killed. An entire generation of young men was practically wiped out in countries like France, Great Britain, and Germany. It was a trauma from which the world, you could argue, would never fully recover. You know, the war didn't just kill people, it killed entire empires. The massive Russian Empire collapsed into revolution in 1917. By the time the war was over, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, and the Ottoman empires were all gone, completely redrawing the map of Europe and the Middle East, and creating a whole host of new and often very unstable countries. And the peace that followed? Well, it was deeply, deeply flawed. The Treaty of Versailles officially ended the war, but its terms were incredibly harsh, especially on Germany. The infamous war guilt clause forced Germany to accept all of the blame. It was ordered to pay crippling financial damages, and its military was severely restricted. This wasn't a peace made between equals. This was a peace that bred resentment and humiliation. But not everyone was celebrating this so-called peace. The French Marshal Ferdinand, who was the supreme Allied commander, made this chillingly accurate prediction back in 1919. He understood that all the anger and instability created by the treaty wouldn't lead to a lasting peace, but would just be a pause in the fighting. And that brings us to our final and most critical question. This conflict was supposed to be so terrible, so devastating, that it would end war forever. But instead, that chain reaction that started way back in 1914, it didn't really end in 1918. The unresolved anger, the economic chaos, that flawed peace treaty, it all created the perfect conditions for the rise of extremism. And just 20 years later, the world would plunge right back into darkness and into an even deadlier war.